my best to accomplish. Welcome this morning. Glad to see you all here. I want to thank the Every Man's Bible class for the invitation to come out. I want to thank Annette Roberts for making this adult education series possible. And thank you for being here. As I said last week, it's hard enough to get people to come to church these days, let alone a Sunday school class. So you're to be commended for being here. So appreciate it very much. Quick review from last time. For the past 2 weeks, we've looked at two different theological understandings of evil and its relationship to God, how it fits into or doesn't to God's good creation. The first week of the session, we looked at what philosophers call privation theory. And this theory, this understanding of evil, was first articulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Plotinus. It's picked up later by the 4th century Christian bishop, St. Augustine. He's the one who develops it for a Christian context. And a thumbnail sketch of privation theory is evil has no real independent existence of its own. Evil only, quote unquote, exists because it attaches itself to good things, namely us. We're good creations of God. We've been gifted with freedom, which is a good gift, but we misuse our freedom and we produce evil. But evil cannot exist on its own. It needs to have something to attach itself to. It's like a parasite. It needs a host organism to survive and thrive. And we are that host organism that allows evil to thrive, according to St. Augustine, according to privation theory. This theory was employed by St. Augustine. He was God's defense attorney. And he essentially got God off the hook using this theory. He said God is not responsible for evil. God created everything and said that it was good. But it was human beings, good human beings who were given the good gift of freedom who opened the door to it. So God is exonerated in Augustine's mind for responsibility for evil. The week prior, we looked at a more modern theory that comes to us from Oxford University, United Kingdom. Two philosophers of religion there, John Hick and Richard Swinburne. And they disagreed with Augustine and broke from him by saying that, yes, God is responsible for a certain amount of evil in the world, and God is responsible for creating a world in which suffering is possible. But they said God is still good because in the minds of these philosophers and in their writings, God, they said, has good reasons for creating a world in which evil and suffering are possible. And the good reasons that these philosophers had in mind was, well, encountering evil and suffering builds character. And they drew on an ancient Christian theologian by the name of Irenaeus in developing this character building dimension to their theory. Ancient theologian Irenaeus said, human beings are created in the image of God in search of the likeness of God. So what he meant by that is human beings are created in a state of moral and spiritual immaturity. And the whole purpose of life is to take these immature persons and move them to a state of maturity, morally and spiritually speaking. And the way that God does this is by putting us into contact with challenges, adversities, suffering, tragedy. And God's hope for our encounters with these things is that we develop compassion, we develop resilience, we develop empathy and understanding, and that through our shared vulnerability, we come together and form bonds of solidarity with one another. We take care of one another as we march together through this difficult thing called life. The problem is, it seems to be with this theory, if it's all true, we're not very good students. We're not doing very well on our journey from immaturity to maturity. So these United Kingdom philosophers of religion say this is the best they can come up with as to why there's evil and suffering in God's good creation. This week, we're going to take a look at what the Bible has to say about these things, or maybe better stated, how the Bible conducts discussions about evil and suffering. Beginning students at Hood Theological Seminary always come into the classroom, and one of their favorite questions is, what does the Bible have to say about this issue, X, Y, or Z? And the faculty, we've heard this question year after year after year, and we have to go into our spiel about what the Bible is and what the Bible isn't, and how the Bible teaches and informs and conveys information to human beings. One of the first things we do when we try to put the Bible into comparative perspective, we tell them, look, we're not dealing with the Analects of Confucius. We're not dealing with the Quran written by Muhammad. We're dealing with a book whose authorship, whose completion took 1,500 years, roughly. We're dealing with a text that has multiple authors from multiple walks of life. We're dealing with writers who were fishermen, doctors, farmers, priests, poets, prophets. They come from all walks of life, and they reflect the diversity of human experience. So we're not dealing with a single text written by a single author. We're dealing with a very complex library of works. And so when someone asks you, what does the Bible have to say about this? If you know about the composition of the Bible, and you know the numerous books and the numerous writers, the amount of time it took to complete the Bible, you have to say, well, we can't just pull a verse out of context and say, here, this chapter and verse, this is what the Bible has to say about this matter. You have to introduce students and the people asking such questions to the fact that the Bible is a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation among different theological perspectives, different writers, and they're talking to one another, back and forth. It's like being at the Thanksgiving Day table with your family. They're arguing with one another, they're testing with one another, they're sticking up with one another. It's a conversation. And to know what the Bible teaches, you have to enter into this conversation, and you have to know the flow of the conversation and the different twists and turns that it takes. Because as the writers are moving through time, politics is changing, economics is changing, culture is changing. Israel's place in the ancient Near East is changing. So all these things are at work when the biblical writers take the pen to scroll and start to talk about what they see God is doing in their space, their time and place in the world. So when we talk about how the Bible talks about evil, kind of have to go through conversation. And if we were blind, the Bible, I guess by analogy, would be when you're using your tactile senses, you're feeling a certain kind of fabric, and then all of a sudden you notice in this garment, maybe that you're feeling, there's a new kind of fabric that comes into play, and then a different one. And that's what the experience is for a reader of the Bible. We see shifts in how the Bible talks about and understands evil as it moves along through time. So the earliest anyway, understanding of evil in the Bible is put forward to us by the writer of the book of Deuteronomy. And for the writer of the book of Deuteronomy, evil is a rather simple thing. Evil is what happens to bad people. Suffering is what happens to bad people. And if you're a good person, you will avoid evil and suffering. It will not be visited upon you, because evil and suffering are given to human beings by God, according to God's justice. So bad things happen to bad people, and good things happen to good people. Now, does that square with your experience of the world? Is that how life works as far as you're concerned? Have you seen the logic of the Deuteronomist writer play out in your life? Bad things happen to bad people, and good things happen to good people. Okay, right. Well, you live long enough, right, and you abandon that fairy tale, and you get enough experience in life, and you see people move through life, and you see bad things happen to those you love, and those you admire, and those you know well. And you know that bad things happen to good people. And unfortunately, good things happen to bad people. So it's not as simple as the Deuteronomist would have us believe. It was the writer of the book of Job who was the first person in the Old Testament to introduce us to maybe the flaws in the writer of the book of Deuteronomy. Because the main point of the book of Job is this evil and suffering business is a lot more complicated than the Deuteronomist thought. That's the contribution of the writer of the book of Job to the conversation. It's not like the Deuteronomist says. Bad things happen to good people. That's what the book of Job is trying to say. And this evil thing is far more complicated than the Deuteronomist would have us believe. And as to the reasons why there is suffering and evil in the world, the book of Job is one of the most frustrating books in the Bible because it doesn't give us a definitive answer by the time the book comes to its conclusion. God finally comes down and encounters Job. God has been hearing Job's complaints, and God does what Job wanted God to do. Come down and face him and explain to him why all these bad things happen to him. And basically, in short, God comes down and says, Job, this is all above your pay grade. You cannot begin to understand why there is evil and suffering in the world. For you to understand these things, you would have to sit where I sit. You would have to know what I know. You would have to be able to see how I see. But you can't, because you're a finite human being in time, in space, in history. You don't have the luxury of an eternal vantage. You can't see how all this stuff works together. And it's kind of a frustrating conclusion, especially if you have a desire to know why people suffer, why there's evil in the world. The message of the book of Job, as I read it anyway, there's different interpretations of it, but it's, you just have to trust that God knows what God is doing. And also that evil is a mystery. It's something that you cannot begin to understand with our tiny intellects. But the book of Job does say a few definitive things. At the end, it says that the Deuteronomist is wrong. The Deuteronomist is played by Job's friends who say, Job, you must have done something wrong. There must be some secret sin that you're harboring. That's why you're suffering. And God, at the conclusion of this book, says, no, Job's friends were wrong in what they said. And God also vindicates Job and how Job conducted himself throughout the whole story of the book. God is saying, Job was right to be mad. Job was right to be angry with me and to protest and to ask why. He didn't do anything wrong, posing hard questions. And then the book comes to an end. Well, as far as our conversation is concerned, as we move through the Bible, this could be, maybe you think this is the best explanation we could get this side of heaven. The book of Job is the best we can do. Or maybe we need to push further. And there were biblical writers who followed after Job who wanted to push further. And we see the first appearance of such a writer in the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel. And this begins this very strange middle portion of the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, which scholars of the Bible say this is the beginning of the apocalyptic period in Jewish thought. And in Daniel 7 to 12, we get these series of strange images of beasts arising out of the sea. These beasts, these monsters that symbolically are present to challenge God's authority, challenge God's sovereignty, challenge God's rule in creation. It's the first time we see evil depicted as this anti-God force that's pushing up and back against God. And so you want to ask yourself, well, where did this come from? Why did Jews start shifting their perspective on evil? Not just something that was a mystery, something that we couldn't understand, but it was this force, this active force that was somehow trying to undo God's creation. It's challenging God's authority. And now God, is engaged in a battle or struggle with these forces. So what happened in Israel's history that caused it to think like this, make this shift? It's theology of evil. There's a lot of different theories out there. One theory is that ancient Jews came into contact with some ancient Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. And this is shows the influence of that theology, that Persian theology, and is mixed into Jewish theology at the time. Other people say that Israel during this time encountered some particularly intense forms of evil in the form of conquering empires, and that were particularly brutal. And the intensity, the overwhelming nature of this evil that they experienced caused them to question whether God was fully in control of the creation. They started to wonder if there were forces out there that were illegal forces, outlaw forces, alien forces that had somehow infiltrated God's creation. And so this was a shift in the way Israel started to conceptualize and think about such things. There's a 400-year gap between the last writing in the Old Testament and the first writing in the New Testament. So by the time we get to the New Testament, there's a lot of interesting questions that scholars have. Well, what happened in these 400 missing years, this gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament? What was going on theologically in the life of Israel? And historians of Judaism look for clues in the New Testament to try to figure out what was going on in this intervening period between the Testaments, because the writers of the New Testament were first century Jews. And they look at the New Testament writings as first century Jewish documents that give us insight into the development, the course of Jewish theology at this time. And many scholars conclude that the vision of evil put forward by Daniel 7 through 12 carried the day and is influencing the way the New Testament writers think about evil and what it's doing in God's good creation. And you get signs of that in, for instance, the opening to the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. The Word is made flesh, and the Word is God, was God, incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus, his entrance into the world in the fourth gospel, the first chapter, is almost characterized like an invasion. Like God has to invade occupying territory. There's something that's happened to creation. Creation has somehow gone wrong. And when God enters God's own world, God does so as a stranger. People don't recognize him. And maybe this is a way the fourth gospel is signaling, look, these forces that were unleashed on creation have taken creation hostage. So when God has entered the world as a liberator, God is not recognized as God, and God's activity is not recognized as liberating activity. People's minds are messed up. Evil has got them all twisted around. And so the gospel is in part God's effort to wire us back correctly so that we can see and think clearly. But the way we do so is by encountering Jesus of Nazareth and watching him walk through the first century. Because as we watch him move through the first century, we're going to get some clues about how evil is operating, what evil is doing, how it sustains its power, and maybe how God can defeat it. So God is at war, which some scholars of the New Testament. God is at war, but I don't know if any of you read comic books. I've read a lot of comic books as a kid. One of the supervillains fascinated me back in my comic book days was a supervillain called the Absorbing Man. Anyone remember the Absorbing Man? Fascinating villain. And what made him such an interesting villain is that the superheroes could not combat him through conventional ways. The Hulk couldn't just smash him into the ground, or Thor couldn't just take out his hammer and pound him into oblivion, because the secret power that the Absorbing Man had that the superheroes didn't realize when they first encountered him was he absorbs their strength. Whatever powers they have, he takes on. So if you try to fight Absorbing Man by pummeling him, he only gets stronger and more powerful. So this introduces a conundrum to the superheroes. How do we defeat an opponent who uses our power against us? You know, we just can't smash this guy with our fists and through violence, through overwhelming strength, because he'll only get stronger. So how do you defeat such an opponent? And this leads to some interesting, discussions in the comic books itself. And my mind started to, started to open up. Reading this is probably my first introduction to philosophy. They're at superhero headquarters. They're saying, well, how do we defeat a guy, who only gets stronger when we fight him through conventional ways? They have to think creatively about how to deal with Absorbing Man. They have to find new and different ways, unconventional ways to fight, nonviolent ways to fight. They have to outsmart Absorbing Man. And I can't help but think of Absorbing Man every time I read through the Gospels, because Jesus, I think, sees what evil is. Jesus sees evil as absorbing. He knows that if he goes toe-to-toe with evil and tries to fight evil on its own terms, evil will only get stronger. And we see this in a crystal clear way when, before his Galilean ministry, Satan pulls him away and tries to tempt him in the wilderness and tries to entice Jesus with trappings of wealth, power. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to play absorbing man's game. If I'm going to beat absorbing man, I have to beat him in a different way. So then he exits the wilderness and moves out into Galilee. And it's the strangest thing, because when you read the Gospels, it's like this guy is out there trolling for him. He's inviting it to come forward. He's like a magnet. He's trying to draw it to him. And there's a lot that's going wrong in first century Galilee. Evil is portrayed by the New Testament writers as this super personal, objective force. We see this in the symbolic characters of Satan and the demons that are active and are at work in Galilee. But these super personal forces can only impact the world insofar as they are working through flesh and blood human beings. Insofar as they can get flesh and blood human beings to cooperate and do their will and express themselves in the world. So we see evil in the New Testament as all corrupt. It's corrupting politics. And we see that it's corrupting politics from the vantage point of the New Testament, because Israel is being ruled by a guy in Rome who says he is God and conqueror, Caesar. He is idolatrously trying to usurp the place of God. And as a human being, is acting like God, behaving like God, speaking like God. So it has corrupted politics. But it has also corrupted the forces of political resistance. There are these guys in the first century Galilee called the Zealots. And they are trying to fight absorbing man in conventional ways. They have long daggers in their cloaks. They pull them out of the cloaks and they try to stab Roman centurions when they're isolated on their own. Or they do guerrilla attacks on Roman infantry and try to take some of them out. And the violence they show to Rome only invites more violence on the part of Rome. And the people who suffer the consequences of the Zealots' revolutionary violent activities are often the average Galileans who are just trying to farm and just try to get by through life. But then these centurions come to town and wipe out the villages because they suspect that Zealots are hiding among them. So this is not working as far as Jesus sees the zealot strategy. But Jesus also sees that evil has corrupted religion. And it's a mistake to just read this as Judaism. In the New Testament itself, there is a critique of religion itself, not just Judaism. Because we see what's happening in first century Judaism and what's happening in 21st century Christianity. Same dynamics are at place. We have the Pharisees, and they are focused on individual moral righteousness. If we just get human beings to be a little more holy, a little more ethical, right, then things will turn around. So they're on everybody's case all the time. You got to do this, you got to do that. And they think that what pleases God, the way to get situation fixed, is just by everyone becoming a little bit more moral. But when you play that moralistic game, you die by the moralistic. Because it's accusatory, it's condemning, it crushes people's spirits, it crushes people's souls, and it turns people against one another because it divides the community into the righteous and the unrighteous. And then the community fractures, the community splits. And then you also have the dirty dogs who are leading the temple. These political, clerical figures. They've cut deals with the Roman Empire. They say, as long as you let us sacrifices. Religion is just about sacrifices, making sure that the cultic practices of the temple continue. As long as we can perform the sacrifices and the ceremonies, Israel, as far as we're concerned, is on track and doing what it's supposed to do. So they cut deals with the Roman Empire. Preserve the temple. Let us do our thing. You let us do our thing, and we'll let you do our thing. So political leaders, religious leaders, cut these deals, make compromises, try to preserve their status and their power through unjust means. But maybe the worst of all is that evil has corruptly debilitated the average citizen. The average Jew in first century Galilee has succumbed to cynicism and despair. There's no hope. They see that the temple is corrupted. They see that, that they're under the boot of the Roman Empire, and they don't see any way that they're going to escape. They're being heavily taxed. They don't have a lot of money. They're just trying to put food on their table, and they're just now living day to day. They're just trying to get by, and there's nothing that's inspiring them, that's producing hope in them, and they've given up. It's into this situation that Jesus of Nazareth steps. And boy, does he have a lot of work to do. He goes to work trying to rectify politics. He said, the kingdom of God is coming. And there is no God but God. You can read between the lines. He's saying Caesar is not God. The Roman Empire is not the kingdom of God. There's something greater than Caesar who is coming. There's a social force, a political force that's on the horizon that will wipe the Roman Empire away. We have to prepare for it. We have to get ready. We have to open our minds and imaginations to this coming new reality. We can't let Caesar occupy our minds. We can't have Caesar derangement syndrome. You've got to create space in the imagination for this thing called the kingdom of God, which is arriving. He also makes some pointed comments to the zealots. He's like, man, you guys, this ain't the way to go. This is not the way to go. The kingdom of God is a peaceful kingdom, right? And the means to the kingdom has to be consistent with the ends of the kingdom. Nonviolent, peaceable conduct is going to be the only way that's going to usher in the kingdom. Violence will only beget violence. And you see this stance of his time and time again. And when dealing with religion, on his mind, and it seems to be what the rest of the religious leaders have forgotten, is the initial promise made to Abraham. That promise made to Abraham was that through Abraham's faithfulness, through the covenant that Abraham made with God, not only would Israel be brought into existence, but the whole purpose of Israel was to provide a blessing to the world. Israel was supposed to be the community of salvation for the entire world. And so Israel has to, according to this anyway, think beyond itself. Think beyond its own security. Think beyond its own survival. Israel's job is to save the rest of the world. Israel doesn't know how this is going to happen. Israel doesn't know when this is going to happen or in what way. But the promise made to Abraham is that it will happen. So this is why Israel is hanging around, not just for its own sake, but for the sake of the world. And this is what the Pharisees have forgotten. And this is what the temple leaders have forgotten. And so Jesus is drawing Israel back to its initial mission statement. You're supposed to be a blessing to the whole world. And look at you. You're in disarray. You're falling apart. You're worried about church attendance. You're worried about the offering plate. You're worried about your own survival. But you've forgotten why you're here. And you're here to participate in the saving of the world, not just the saving of yourself. And lastly, to the average Galileans who have given up hope and who have succumbed to cynicism, he tries to give them a reason to believe, to have hope, to have faith in the future. He said, you are strong when you come together and are not governed by fear and paranoia. And there's a wonderful scene in New Testament scholar Eric Tyson's book, The Shadow of the Galilee. He reimagines the feeding of the multitudes. The real miracle in the feeding of the multitudes, according to Tyson, was everyone stopped being afraid. They stopped being afraid of not having enough food. So they went to their homes and they brought out all the food that they were hoarding in their cellars. And everyone had enough to eat that day because they stopped being afraid of not having enough. And this was the reason why the miracle took place, because fear had been dissipated through the words and presence of Jesus, and they started sharing abundantly with one another. In this first stage, Jesus is dealing with evil by exposing it. He's drawing it forth. He's trying to make it visible. He wants evil to be seen for what it actually is. But evil doesn't like to be seen. Evil does not like to be exposed. Evil would rather stay in the shadows where people can't detect it. Evil wants to masquerade itself as good. It wants to masquerade itself as respectable. But Jesus' job in this New Testament, this first phase, is to draw it out, to reveal its true nature. He sort of sets a trap for evil, and that trap is himself. He's trying to draw evil to himself. Rather than being absorbed by absorbing man, he is trying to absorb absorbing man into himself. And we see this in the cross and the events leading up to it. The Roman Empire crucifies him. And the Roman Empire, in so doing, reveals itself not to be what it claims to be, the source of truth and justice, but to be the perverter of justice by being the state apparatus that puts him to death. Religion is exposed because they're the ones that hand him over to the Roman Empire. Their Messiah, their Savior, they're the ones that are supposed to welcome him, hand him over to be crucified. So religion itself is betraying God in a literal sense. And then the people that he tried to inspire and give hope to, they call out for his crucifixion, the mob in Jerusalem. They say, give us the zealot, free the zealot, let him live. This one who was trying to change things through peace and nonviolence, let him be crucified. So the people turn his back on him. The thing about the New Testament is, once you see something, you can't unsee it. And this is the genius of Jesus, is that he drew evil out. He exposed the empire as evil. He exposes religion as corrupted evil. And he exposes the people, right, as not being able to free themselves from cynicism and despair by embracing the way of Barabbas the zealot rather than the way of Jesus, asking him to be liberated rather than Jesus. Jesus seems to be be dealing with evil by letting evil have its way with him. Jesus lets evil have its way with him. And you say, this is not a good strategy. This seems to be just allowing evil a great victory by just laying down and letting evil consume you. If Jesus of Nazareth was God incarnate, if the doctrine of the Trinity is correct, when evil is consuming Jesus, evil is consuming God. And when evil consumes God, if the depiction of the doctrine of the Trinity is correct, on Good Friday, once Jesus expires, the first and third persons of the Trinity have lost the second person of the Trinity. The second person of the Trinity has died on the cross. God has now experienced loss. God knows firsthand the power of evil and what evil can do, what evil can take away. Jesus has been consumed by death. God incarnate has been taken over by death. Death and suffering and loss have been taken up into God's own life, according to Trinitarian doctrine. This is correct. Easter Sunday is the restoration of the second person to the first and third person. God has taken all that evil has to offer, has to throw at it, taken it into God's self, and achieved victory, overcome those forces through Easter. What does this mean? Well, some theologians, in an attempt to understand this, say there is now no place that you can go in God's good creation where God is not. There is no such place as, or such thing as God forsakens. You can never suffer so much or encounter so much evil that when you are in those moments, in those times, in those places, God is not with you. Because God has now been right where you are. God has gone to the basement. God has gone as low as can be gone. So that there's nowhere you can descend where God is not. Because God has taken all the things that face us into God's self. God is not sitting up in a luxury box at Bank of America Stadium watching the players play on the field. God has gotten on the field, God's self, and has taken all that life, human life, has to throw at him, and has survived, and has conquered, and has been given victory over those things. The New Testament says evil and suffering are now beaten enemies. Are beaten enemies. Their final eradication is all but assured. But one theologian has said, what happened with Jesus of Nazareth is equivalent to D-Day. Evil and suffering have been dealt a terrible blow. That their end is certain, but we're still waiting on V-Day to finish them off. So we are living right now between D-Day and V-Day, according to the New Testament. Evil has been dealt a blow that it can never recover from, but it's trying to take as many of us down as it can, while it still has the time left on the clock. The good news that the church has been entrusted to deliver is that evil and suffering have been defeated in Jesus of Nazareth, through Jesus of Nazareth, through God, through what God has done through this person. In the 1960s, some shipping vessels discovered some Pacific islands where Japanese soldiers had not yet heard the news that the emperor had been defeated. They were on these Pacific islands still fighting with their guns and their ammunition, thinking that the war was still going on. The message that the church has is that the war is over. God has won. You can lay down your arms. You don't have to give evil any more oxygen, any more energy. It's a beaten enemy. But you have to live as if that is true. You have to live as if that is true. And the way you live as if that's true is the way Jesus lived. Through hope, through nonviolence, through combating cynicism, by trying to bring people together, ending the divisions that are plaguing humanity. So if you live as if evil has been beaten, that's your contribution to V-Day, as we're sandwiched in between V-Day and V-Day at present. That's enough for me. Questions or thoughts? This is not going to satisfy a lot of philosophers. It's the gospel is something that is hard for persons who operate according to logic and the rules of reason and rationality. It's not going to satisfy them. The problem of evil is still going to be a conundrum, a challenge. But this is the way Christians historically, especially the early Christians, tried to make sense of these things. And the question is whether this mindset can be recovered again in the 21st century. I don't know. Any thoughts or any questions?